Have you ever felt like you're living in two different worlds? One world where everyone seems to naturally accept the rules of the game, where people move with almost automatic confidence through systems that to you seem fundamentally questionable, and another world, your inner world, where a persistent voice whispers that something is deeply wrong with the way we organize our lives, our societies, our most basic values. If you know that feeling of being out of place, that experience of being the only one in the room who seems to see the giant elephant everyone is ignoring, then you're not alone. In fact, you might be experiencing something Yuval Noah Harari has identified as one of the most troubling phenomena of our time: the systematic silencing of those who have developed a sharper awareness of the fundamental contradictions of our age. Imagine the following scene for a moment. You're in a work meeting, or maybe at a family dinner, or even in a casual conversation with friends. Someone casually mentions how normal it is to work 60 hours a week to afford an apartment that barely feels like home, or how natural it is for children to spend more time staring at screens than playing outside, or how it's inevitable that we must constantly consume to keep the economy running. And while everyone nods in agreement, you feel a growing unease. A voice in your head asks, why do we accept this as normal? Why don't we question these structures that seem to drain our vitality? But when you dare to voice these questions, when you try to share your concerns, something interesting and disturbing happens. People around you begin to pull away, not physically, but emotionally. They change the subject, make jokes to ease the tension, or worse, start treating you as if you're overly pessimistic, complicated, or even mentally unstable. It's as if your ability to see through society's collective illusions is interpreted not as a sign of heightened awareness, but as a personal flaw that must be corrected or silenced. This experience, you may have lived through countless times, reflects a much broader and more systematic pattern that Harari observed in his research on how human societies function. Throughout history, there have always been individuals capable of seeing beyond the dominant narratives of their time, people who could perceive the internal contradictions of the systems they were embedded in. However, our era has unique characteristics that make the silencing of these individuals more sophisticated and effective than ever before. To understand how we got to this point, we must first recognize a fundamental truth about the nature of human societies. They depend, for their functioning, on shared myths, collective stories that everyone agrees to believe in, even when those stories do not necessarily align with objective reality. 10,000 years ago, our ancestors believed in gods who lived in the mountains and controlled the harvests. Today, we believe in concepts like infinite economic growth, absolute meritocracy, and inevitable technological progress. The difference lies not in the truth of these beliefs, but in the complexity of the systems we've built to sustain them, and in the sophistication of the mechanisms we've developed to silence those who question them. Harari argues that the most striking feature of our era is not just the prevalence of these collective narratives, but the way we've developed extremely refined methods to neutralize intellectual dissent without resorting to physical violence or explicit censorship. In authoritarian societies of the past, questioners were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. In our society, they are subtly marginalized through much more elegant and therefore far more effective mechanisms. The first of these mechanisms could be called the pathologizing of critical consciousness. When someone systematically questions the fundamental structures of our society, when someone persistently sees through the collective illusions that keep our system functioning, that person is often redirected to the mental health system. Not because they have a genuine psychological disorder, but because their way of seeing the world represents a threat to the harmonious functioning of social machinery. Depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, autism spectrum, all these diagnoses can be applied to individuals whose main pathology is an excessive sensitivity to the contradictions inherent in our time. What's particularly insidious about this process is that it works even when the mental health professionals involved have the best of intentions. A therapist may genuinely want to help a patient who is suffering because they can't accept the normalcy of working in a morally questionable job, or because they feel alienated in a culture obsessed with status and consumption. But the help offered almost always focuses on adapting the individual to the demands of society, rather than questioning whether those demands are legitimate. The therapeutic goal becomes to help the person function better within the existing system, not to develop a deeper understanding of why the system might be causing suffering in the first place. The second mechanism of silencing is even more subtle, and perhaps for that reason, even more powerful. The creation of escape valves that channel critical energy into harmless directions. Our society has developed an extraordinary ability to absorb and neutralize dissent by turning it into a commodity, a consumer product. Protest music becomes the soundtrack for soda commercials. Revolutionary art becomes decoration in corporate offices. Counterculture movements become lifestyles that can be purchased in specialty stores. More importantly, we've created seemingly safe spaces where people can express their frustrations and questions without having any real impact on power structures. Social media serves as a perfect example of this phenomenon. They offer the illusion that we're participating in a great public debate, that our voices are being heard, that we can influence change through our posts and shares. In reality, they mainly serve as a way to capture and dissipate revolutionary energy, channeling it into endless debates within isolated bubbles that rarely translate into effective action in the real world. The person who could be organizing real movements for social transformation spends their energy on online debates that generate much heat but little light and certainly no significant structural change. The third mechanism may be the cruelest of all: the exploitation of the fundamental human need for belonging to keep questioners isolated and powerless. Human beings are social animals, and our mental health critically depends on feeling like we belong to a community, that we are understood and accepted by our peers. Individuals with higher critical awareness often find that their sharp insight condemns them to a peculiar form of loneliness. They see through the illusions that keep most people comfortable, but that clarity of vision puts them in a position where it's extremely difficult to form genuine connections with others. How do you maintain close friendships when you realize that most social conversations revolve around trivialities or the unconscious perpetuation of systems you find fundamentally problematic. How do you build romantic relationships when your partner seems perfectly comfortable with a lifestyle that to you represents a betrayal of your deepest values? This loneliness is not accidental. It is a natural byproduct of a system that rewards conformity and subtly punishes those who refuse to accept the basic premises upon which our society is built. The result is that the people most capable of articulating alternatives to the status quo often find themselves isolated, doubting their own perceptions, questioning whether it might just be easier to accept things as they are and find a way to adapt. But here we arrive at the most disturbing point of Harari's analysis. What happens when this process of silencing becomes so effective that even those with the highest potential for critical awareness begin to silence themselves before society needs to do it? When we internalize the mechanisms of control so deeply that we don't even realize we are censoring our own thoughts? This phenomenon, which we might call preventive self-silencing, can be observed in multiple areas of contemporary life. In academia, young researchers quickly learn which questions can be asked and which must be avoided if they want a successful career. In the corporate world, employees develop a refined intuition about which insights can be shared in meetings and which must be kept to themselves. Even in informal conversations, we develop internal sensors that alert us when we are approaching intellectual territory that might place us in conflict with social expectations. What's most frightening is that this process often happens completely unconsciously. We don't notice that we're editing our thoughts, filtering our perceptions, dulling our ability to see clearly, because we've learned through thousands of subtle social interactions that certain types of clarity are socially undesirable. We develop a kind of voluntary blindness that protects us from the discomfort of constantly being in conflict with the world around us, but also deprives us of the ability to contribute to the transformations our society so desperately needs. Harari suggests that we are living in a particularly dangerous time because the challenges we face as a species require exactly the kind of critical thinking and radical questioning that our social systems are programmed to suppress. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, growing global inequality, these are all problems that cannot be solved within the conceptual frameworks that created them in the first place. We need people capable of questioning foundational assumptions, imagining radical alternatives, seeing beyond the limits imposed by the dominant narratives of our time. But precisely these people are the ones our social systems are most determined to silence or neutralize. It's as if we're facing a burning house while systematically discouraging anyone who questions whether our traditional firefighting methods are suitable for this particular type of fire. The irony is that our survival may depend precisely on the voices we are working so diligently to silence. This paradox becomes even more evident when we consider the speed of technological transformations we are witnessing. Artificial intelligence is not just changing how we work or communicate. It is fundamentally altering what it means to be human in a world where machines can perform many functions we once thought uniquely ours. But public discussions about these transformations tend to be dominated by two equally inadequate perspectives: the naive technological optimism that sees every innovation as automatic progress, and the reactionary pessimism that simply wants to stop the clock and return to an idealized past. We have almost no room for the voices that could offer more nuanced perspectives, voices that could help us navigate these transformations more consciously and deliberately. These voices exist, but they are systematically marginalized because their analyses do not fit into the simplified categories that dominate public discourse. Pause for a moment and ask yourself which aspect of this technological future we're building most troubles you. Do you also find yourself late at night wondering whether we're building a world where our essential humanity will still have a place? I know many of us carry these concerns in silence, perhaps afraid of seeming old-fashioned or resistant to progress. But your concerns are valid and likely shared by more people than you think. If you feel this anxiety about our collective future, share in the comments a word or phrase that captures your main fear. Your voice could help create a space where we can honestly discuss these shared fears instead of suppressing them. And maybe by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them with greater wisdom and humanity. The question Harari invites us to contemplate is whether it is still possible to reverse this trend of silencing before it collectively renders us incapable of adequately responding to the existential challenges we face. He offers no easy or optimistic answers, but suggests that the first step is to recognize that the problem exists and to understand how it operates. The awareness that we are being subtly manipulated into self-censoring our most important insights is in itself a form of resistance. When we begin to notice the mechanisms through which we internalize conformity, when we become aware of how our need to belong can be exploited to keep us intellectually docile, we create the possibility of making more deliberate choices about when to conform and when to resist social pressures. This does not mean we should become systematically contrarian or question everything all the time. It means we must develop the ability to distinguish between genuine conformity based on values and analyses we consider valid and imposed conformity based on fear of the social consequences of thinking independently. One of Harari's most interesting proposals is the need to create new kinds of social spaces, spaces where radical questioning can flourish without automatically resulting in social marginalization. This may sound utopian, but there are already examples, although limited, of communities that have managed to create cultures where genuine intellectual disagreement is valued rather than punished. Some universities, some organizations, some online communities are able to maintain environments where it is safe to question fundamental premises, where the ability to see through collective illusions is recognized as a valuable contribution rather than a threat to social harmony. The challenge is to expand these spaces and make them more accessible to those who need them most. This requires a deep cultural shift in how we understand the role of intellectual dissent in healthy societies. Instead of seeing questioners as disruptive elements that need to be neutralized, we need to learn to see them as canaries in the coal mines, as early warning systems that can help us identify problems before they become crises. This also requires developing more sophisticated ways of distinguishing between constructive and destructive questioning, between genuine critique based on rigorous analysis and reflexive contrarianism based on resentment or confusion. Perhaps more importantly, Harari suggests that we need to fundamentally rethink the relationship between individuality and collectivity in our societies. The dominant model tends to present these two dimensions as fundamentally opposed. Either you conform to social expectations and sacrifice your individual authenticity, or you maintain your personal integrity and accept social isolation as the price. But this is a false dichotomy. It is possible to imagine forms of social organization that honor both the human need for belonging and the diversity of individual perspectives. In fact, truly healthy communities depend on this creative tension between social cohesion and intellectual diversity. The problem arises when the mechanisms that maintain social cohesion become so powerful that they stifle intellectual diversity, or when the celebration of individuality becomes so extreme that social cooperation becomes impossible. The balance between these forces is delicate and requires conscious attention and constant adjustment. In our time, the pendulum has clearly swung too far in the direction of forced conformity, and a correction is needed if we are to maintain our collective capacity for adaptation and growth. Harari's analysis also leads us to question some of our most basic assumptions about what constitutes mental sanity and psychological health. If a person is suffering because they cannot accept fundamental aspects of a society that may be on a destructive path, is it really appropriate to define the problem as residing in the person rather than in society? Obviously, there are genuine cases of mental illness that require therapeutic intervention, but there are also cases where what is diagnosed as individual pathology may be better understood as a healthy response to pathological circumstances. The ability to feel anguish in response to environmental destruction, growing social inequality, or the dehumanization of modern life may be a sign of elevated moral awareness, not psychological dysfunction. This does not mean we should romanticize suffering or discourage people from seeking help when they are struggling. It means we need more sophisticated frameworks to distinguish between suffering that indicates a need for individual adaptation and suffering that indicates a need for social transformation. It also means we need forms of therapy that can help people cope with existential anguish without necessarily eliminating the perceptions that are causing it. Another important implication of Harari's analysis is the need to rethink our educational systems. If one of the unconscious functions of modern education is to prepare people to accept without question the basic structures of our society, then it is not surprising that it tends to discourage exactly the types of critical thinking and radical questioning we most need. This does not mean we should abandon formal education, but it does mean we need educational approaches that cultivate the ability to question fundamental premises, that teach people to think independently, and that develop the emotional resilience necessary to deal with the loneliness and marginalization that can accompany non-conventional thinking. This requires educators who themselves have developed these capacities, who have learned to navigate the tension between teaching established knowledge and encouraging radical questioning. It also requires educational systems that can tolerate and even celebrate a diversity of perspectives, rather than merely rewarding those who can most efficiently reproduce the answers deemed correct. The most disturbing aspect of all this is the possibility that we may have already passed a tipping point, that the mechanisms of silencing have become so sophisticated and pervasive that our collective capacity for self-correction has been severely compromised. Harari offers no guarantees that it is still possible to reverse these trends, but he suggests that our only hope lies in the conscious and deliberate cultivation of spaces where radical questioning can still flourish. This may mean creating new institutions, developing new technologies, or simply forming informal communities of individuals committed to maintaining their ability to think independently. It may also mean developing new personal practices that help us maintain our clarity of vision amid the constant pressures to conform. Meditation, contemplation, journaling, all of these are practices that can help preserve internal spaces where non-conventional thoughts can arise and be examined before being automatically filtered out by our self-censorship mechanisms. Here we arrive at the heart of the question Harari presents to us. Our survival as a species may depend on our ability to keep the flame of radical questioning alive, even when all social forces conspire to extinguish it. This is not a task that can be delegated to experts or institutions. It is something each of us must assume as a personal responsibility. Every time we choose to express a non-conventional perspective, despite the social discomfort it may cause, every time we choose to maintain our ability to see through collective illusions, despite the loneliness it may entail, we are contributing to the preservation of something essential to humanity's future. Every time we create spaces where others feel safe to express their deepest questions, we are participating in the building of a culture that values critical awareness rather than suppressing it. This is not about becoming a revolutionary or a professional dissident. It is about keeping our capacity to think for ourselves awake and creating conditions where others can do the same. The vision Harari offers us is simultaneously dark and hopeful. Dark because it shows how we have been subtly trained to silence our own most important insights, how we have developed internal censorship mechanisms that may be depriving us of the wisdom we need most at this critical moment in human history. Hopeful because it suggests that once we understand these mechanisms, once we become aware of how they operate, we have the possibility to make different choices. Consciousness, Harari suggests, is the first step toward freedom. When we stop automatically silencing our sharpest perceptions, when we create spaces where genuine questioning can flourish, when we learn to value the diversity of perspectives, even when it makes us uncomfortable, we are participating in the creation of a different kind of society. A society robust enough to face the extraordinary challenges that lie ahead, flexible enough to adapt to circumstances we cannot predict, and wise enough to correct its own mistakes before they become irreversible catastrophes. If these reflections resonated with something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't been able to fully articulate, know that you are not alone on this journey. There is a growing community of people awakening to these same insights, refusing to accept the silencing of their critical awareness, seeking ways to keep their questioning alive. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with others who share these concerns and this commitment to maintaining spaces where genuine thought can flourish. Every week, we explore together the great questions of our time, not to find definitive answers, but to develop our collective capacity to ask the right questions at the right moment. This is not just an intellectual journey, but a practice of resistance, a way to keep alive the flame of critical awareness in an era that constantly pressures us to extinguish it. Join us in this essential project of preserving and cultivating the human capacity to see clearly, to question boldly, and to imagine possibilities that do not yet exist, but may determine the future of our species.
What I try to do in all my works is help people understand themselves, help people understand reality better. It's a very delicate job because people usually rush to judge reality and to judge history, to judge the past and the present. We want to know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, whether things are good or bad. When we rush to judge things, we don't have time to understand them. In my writing, I try to write history without villains, without good guys and bad guys, but to understand the deep process of change. And I sometimes think about history maybe as a kind of collective therapy.
We have no experience in history of a less intelligent species that manages to control a more intelligent species. Horses don't control us. Cows don't control us. We control them. What happens when we create a more intelligent species than us? These super intelligent AIs. So maybe in the short term, it will be good for our economic growth and prosperity. But what happens in 20, 30, 50 years when millions of super intelligent AIs run the world? They manage the financial system, the military system, the cultural system. How will humanity be able to coexist with a new super intelligent species? This is the big question.
I think about climate change. One of the things that people should realize is what is the cost of preventing catastrophic climate change? What size of a check do you need to write if you want to solve this? How much money? And nobody knows for sure, but the best estimates we have, something like 2%, 3%, maybe 5% of global GDP. Now, this is a lot, but it's completely doable. If I told you it's 50%, then forget it. We are not going to do it. It's not like if you're a dinosaur 65 million years ago, when the asteroid comes, then don't bother. I mean, there is nothing you can do about it. But we are not like the dinosaurs. To shift even 5% of our resources from one field to another, this is what politicians do all the time.